Some people say that evolution is just a theory. Well, it's pretty much a proven theory, making it close to a law, a scientific law. Okay, let's look at evidence that supports the theory of evolution. We already looked at one strong line of evidence for evolution. That's the fossil record. The deeper you dig in sedimentary rock that hasn't been disturbed over the ages, the older fossils you'll find. You can radioactively date them, and you can see from the fossils that the creatures that the fossils are from aren't existing now. Species change over time with the changing of the earth. The species have to change as well to survive, as we talked about. So, evidence for evolution, fossils, we kind of talked about those. We'll say some more. The comparisons between the fossils. A forensic scientist or paleontologist, a fossil expert, can figure out what, from the structure, what kind of lifestyle that animal had, or plant, or bacteria. It's harder to do with bacteria. We'll talk about that. We can now, with our modern technology of biochemistry, we can compare the DNA or protein sequences in the fossil and compare them to modern species and see how far apart evolutionarily in time they are. You can do that with current species. I mean, you can see who we're most related to, our species is most related to, or most distantly related to, by comparing certain genes that all life has. And the variations in those nucleotides will tell us the more variation there is, the more evolutionally separated we are. You can also do that with amino acids in a sequence in the proteins. And then we don't do this anymore because it's not, I mean, it's interesting, but it's not as precise. We can compare the embryos of different animals and see, the stages of development, how they differ or how they are similar. Then biogeography is the location of where the fossils are. So we talked about continental drift already, so we can see what the time. We can tell from similar fossils on continents that were once joined. We can kind of guesstimate what the world looked like, the crust of the earth and the continents looked like back in time. And again, that's proof of continental drift. Okay, I mentioned if you have sedimentary rock isn't really disturbed. I mean, here's a canyon that a river, looks like part of the Grand Canyon, a river carved out over the ages. And you can see, different layers. And the deeper you go down towards the river, the older fossils you'll find there. We can also age the rock by radioactive dating. So we can put a year, approximate century that organism that produced that fossil was living at. Florida is made of sedimentary rock and sand on top, but it exists because the state of Florida exists because that rock was lifted to the surface as the mountains were forming. The Rocky Mountains were forming. So we have, like this says, we have very complete fossil records of some living species. Like here's the modern horse. And the deeper we dig, we find fossils. And we can compare the anatomy of their teeth and bones, like their limbs. So we see the ancient ancestor of the horse was kind of like the shape of a dog. And he didn't have hoofs. He had toes. And then he probably was an he was probably a carnivore and an herbivore, because look at his little teeth. Now you can tell that the toes start to fuse. I mean, they start. That was an adaptation for galloping through and migrating through prairies. So those toes fused to form a hoof. And also the molars became flatter so that they could grind the grass and up better, showing that they were vegetarians specialized in eating plants. So if you look at the chart, 55 million years ago, that's what the ancestor of the horse looks like. Now, that's an artist's impression, because, of course, we don't have a picture of what a horse looks like. We have the skeleton. And so an artist, a scientific artist, can fill in the muscles and flesh. Okay, these are stromatolites, and they're layers of photosynthetic bacteria that just grew and died on these big blobs of now rock. So they're 3.5 billion years old, and that's been verified by radioactive dating of the rock. Here's a picture much later on, 550 million years old, millions, not billions, showing one of the earliest multicellular animals, very simple, but made of many cells. Sometimes the fossil is so well preserved that you still got the protein, you still got flesh that has been, and organs that have been preserved because the way it was buried. So here we have 110 million years ago, this dinosaur mummy. It's not bone. I mean, there's bone in it, but you can see the skin, even the eye of the dinosaur. So evolution is a process of changing, but the changes build up on each other. It's not like all of a sudden you have a whole brand new body plan. No, you build on the body plan. So there's intermediate steps between, for example, that fossil of the original horse ancestor, and little steps bring it to, evolutionary steps bring it up to what a modern horse looks like. And we're lucky if we find intermediate steps in the fossils. We call those transitional fossils. Now, sometimes it's hard to find those transitional fossils for other kinds of animals, and it's like they all of a sudden pop up. So when they do find one, like I'm going to show you, it's called a missing link, because scientists have found a transitional form that between two very different types of animals today. It's where speciation occurred in a phylogenetic tree. That's where new species are formed. And that transitional state, that missing link shows it. So here is a weird looking animal that looks like a missing link between dinosaurs and birds. Birds have very, very delicate, lightweight bones for flight. And this guy, I don't know if he flew, but he has very, very lightweight bones. He has claws like birds, but other dinosaurs do too. He actually has teeth, which isn't bird-like. Birds don't have teeth. And actually, he has feathers, as you'll see. Feathers, as you'll see in the next picture. So this is Archaeopteryx, famous. You can see the fragile bones right there. You can see the bird-like claws. You see, I don't really see the head in this picture. So another picture will show the teeth. Okay, but you can obviously see the feathers. An imprint of where the feathers were, the way this was preserved, and a feathery tail as well. Here's the missing link between fish and amphibians like salamanders and frogs. The head looks like the skull of a salamander or a frog. And I'm sure there's other details that I'm not aware of that an expert could point out, showing fish-like and amphibian-like features. When you compare the body structures from the skeletons, it's called, when you study the anatomy of the fossils, this lends evidence for Darwin's explanation of evolution as being descent with modification. Okay, so you got a body plan, and you add to it gradually until eventually it's a new species over time. And again, I said you add to it. Mutations cause little changes, and these can be adaptations, and the adaptations just keep on coming about and being selected for, natural selection, as the environment changes. So this is evidence when you study the fossil bones of descent with modifications. So paleontologists are hired by museums to keep the fossil record and to show people and other scientists the modification, descent with modification from an early form to a more modern form. Now, anatomists look for homologous structures. Okay, so homologous structures are anatomical structures like bones that were modified by mutations over time and selected, naturally selected, and even to the point of these homologous structures being used in a different way than they were before. So, like the toe bones and the hoof of the bones under the hoof of a horse and its ancestors are homologous structures. So this is the front limb of 4 different vertebrates: us, a cat, a whale, and a bat. And you can see how the bones have been adapted over time, and they have different functions. Our hand, for example, has fingers, then the palm of your hand bones, and then you have on and radius for twisting your arm. Then the one that's connected to your shoulder blade is the humerus, and you can see that in all these different kinds of animals. Now, they have totally different shapes, but you can tell that they were derived in the same way. So we have the 2 bones, the radius and ulna, right here. We got the palm, or the metacarpals, the palm bones right here in green, even though a whale doesn't have a palm on its flipper. And the bat wing, I can't think of that as a hand, but it's the same kind of, it's the same, they're derived from a common ancestor that had all these things, and then these were modified over time by in these different species. Then you have the phalanges, and look how different they are for the different purposes of these, what they're used for by these animals. So we see different functions of homologous structures in these limbs. Some designed for swimming, some for flying, some for walking, some for holding things or digging in soil. Okay, so before we could do DNA or protein comparisons, this was how phylogenetic trees were figured out. The similarity in the homologous structures was used to figure out who had more recent common ancestor and therefore were more closely related. So it looks like we're more related to here's us. Looks like we're going to be more related to the turtle than we are to a reptile like an alligator or a bird. Whereas a bird and a reptile are more closely related. but the common ancestor of all of them was a fish, ancient fish. And there you see the fin, the thick fin of the ancient fish. So here's a phylogenetic tree based on the comparison of the beaks and for finches. So I'd much rather do this by comparing their DNA because it's more precise. But this is what they used to do before they could analyze DNA or before they even knew about DNA. Now, a vestigial structure is a homologous structure, okay, to other species structures, but we've lost the function of it. So here we have a cormorant. We see these in Florida, but they have wings. This guy doesn't need wings for some reason. Where he lives, he doesn't have wings. He doesn't fly. So the bones in here, or his wings themselves, are vestigial structures. The flight function has completely disappeared. You still have the bones, very small and shrunken, compared to what his ancestor had. It's pretty cool. Vestigial structures in the whale. The whale has a pelvis, the hip bones, and has a femur, the big leg bone in the top of your leg. But they're useless. He doesn't have back fins or legs. So this is a leftover, a vestigial structure of our hip and our leg bones. Again, vestigial structures are homologous to what other related animals, evolutionarily related animals, have. A snake, like I was saying before, has very shrunken hips and femurs, but the rest of the appendage has disappeared. There's no point to having this. It's just a hint of what its ancestor had, its evolutionary ancestor had. At one point, the ancestor of snakes had limbs that allowed it to crawl, but over time, they lost that because they had other adaptations to make them successful and made, and the hip and leg bones became unnecessary. The small intestine. Our appendix. Here's the stomach. Here's the intestines. And right before, there's a small intestine. And here's the large intestine. It's all coiled up. It's not like this. It's just spread out. And right before the large intestine, there's this little tubular structure that is called our appendix. And it is super shrunk. Really, we don't think it has any purpose. But in our past, when we were more vegetarian, it served as a place for fiber, cellulose, to be digested, like cattle and other organisms do that are herbivores. So in a rabbit, the intestine's large, and it's like a place where food is digested. That is where microorganisms live in symbiosis with the animal, and they digest the cellulose for the animal, and the animal profits from that. So you can see zebras are herbivores. Koala bear eats eucalyptus leaves. He is a big one. Kangaroos, I guess kangaroos are omnivores. And possums are omnivores. They like meat, and they'll eat grass and vegetation if they need to. But in animals where it's smaller, that's where they're more of an omnivore, a meat eater. And they don't need that to digest cellulose. We know how old fossils are because they're found in rocks, and we can radioactively age the rocks. We can determine the age of the rocks with radioactive half-lives. Okay, fossil evidence tells us that whales have an ancestor that resembled a wolf that hunted on the shore. What would be evidence for this? Well, if you read these, that's not evidence. Some guy imagining it. Stories, that's not evidence. Myths, legends, nah. Relatives of polar bears because they live on land and hunt in the sea. What? That's not evidence either. That's jumps in conclusions. Fossils of a transitional creature that had characteristics of both whales and wolves. Okay, that is a line of evidence, hard evidence. Okay, so some fossils form by how? So if I read through this, organisms become exposed. Well, that's not forming a fossil. That's exposing a body. Some fossils are formed by when animals rot. That's not really saying how a fossil forms. That's how the animal is broken down, how his molecules return back to the earth. Non-organic material remains when bacteria cannot decompose an organism. Okay, that's true. Like the dinosaur, that would be a fossil, I guess. But I guess if it's not bony, it's not a fossil. It's an actual mummy. So this would be the best one. Remnants of a dead organism are preserved in layers of stone within Earth's crust. Not a very well-written question. Okay, I didn't really talk about comparing embryology, but yeah, our hands develop like web hands at first in the fetus, in the baby, and then what happens are the lysosomes eat away and we get the fingers and the thumb. So I guess this is showing our ancestry to like fish and web feet like ducks, but it's not very precise. So that'd be comparative embryology. Okay, different beak sizes, different adaptations. We're looking at homologous structures. So that's comparative anatomy. You're looking at part of their body and comparing them. All plants have roots, stems, leaves. Each species has unique, different kinds of roots, stem, and leaves, but they all serve the same function. This is evidence that they have a common ancestor, which I find represents two homologous structures. The wings of a bird, scales, the wings of a bat, and the flipper on a whale. Yeah, I just showed you that they have very similar bones, but totally different shapes and adaptations for different usages, functions. So I say letter B. The legs of a fly and the wings of a bird. No, there's no bones in a fly's leg. The antenna, insect, and the eyes. They're both sensory organs, but they're not related. Vestigial structure is one that is no longer necessary, has lost its function, is losing its form if it hasn't already, so all of the above. The wings of a penguin are vestigial. Yeah, penguins cannot fly. True. But at one point they could. I mean, in the far past, they're a common ancestor with some other kinds of birds that can. Now, the best way you can compare how closely related you are to another type of species is to compare the amino acid order or sequence for a protein that both species has. And the more closely the protein sequence matches, the more closely you're related. You can do that with the gene for that protein if you want instead. So here they're mentioning what I've been saying, using gene and protein sequences, comparing them between different species, tells you how closely related one is to the other. The more likenesses, the more closely they're related. And it's less space consuming and time consuming process than doing anatomical comparisons between fossils. So it lends strong evidence for descent with modification. So here's the comparison of a mouse and a fly's genes, at least part of them. And you can see that the green is showing the similarities and the white ones show the differences. And you got a computer that can do this. You feed the DNA into this computer and it can read the types of bases in their order and then quickly compare them and tell you what percentage are similar. Okay, so if the gene sequences are similar, the proteins that those genes code for are also similar. So here we have, let's see, what are we comparing? These 6 species of animals. And we're looking at cytochrome is a protein. It's a protein electron transport chain of respiration in the mitochondria. So we're comparing the DNA sequence for that protein from these 6 different species. Yeah. So this is the difference, the percent difference. So closer to 0%, the more closely related they are. So chimpanzees and ours are identical for that protein code, that cytochrome code in the DNA. Then we can see how the difference goes with different species. So sheep, 10% different, rattlesnake, etc. And the garden snail, about 30% different. So this is showing, again, proof that for the unity of life is very diverse, but underlying the diversity in all these species, for example, there's unity. We use the same genetic code. We have the same enzymes, a lot of the same enzymes. The more closely related we are, the more similar will be our DNA and proteins. So that we have cytochrome shows we share a common ancestor. But the more different we are in our sequences, the earlier our common ancestor would be. So the garden where the tree branched off, the garden snail branched off before here's humans and here's the chimpanzees. Here's a snail. So the common ancestor of us and chimps are more recent than the common ancestor of us and the snail. As I mentioned before, we used to compare embryos at different stages of development. So if you have two animals that are similar, related, their embryological stages will be more similar, and the two embryos will look very similar until later in development. Whereas if you're not very similar, if you're not very related to them, the stages will differ earlier on in development. So I guess here humans and pigs are the most related. So if you look at later stages, they're very similar. You can see a tail here, though. We don't have a tail. Our tail is a vestigial organ, whereas obviously lizards don't look like us, even at an early stage. Okay, so this is not, again, you don't do this anymore because first of all, you're killing the embryo to study it, and there's cleaner, more accurate ways to determine evolutionary relationships. Okay, but if you do look at a human embryo early on, this is supposed to be the head right here. here's the foot forming, here's the feet the leg forming, and the arms forming. Right here is the tail, which will disappear after a while. It's vestigial. We even have gill slits. That we don't have gills, but that is a vestigial organ that we lose early on. We don't need gill slits. We have lungs to breathe. Right here is what I was talking about, the foot or the hand. We have webbed hands at first, early stage, 48 days. And then what happens is, as the fingers form, the cells in the web self-destruct and form the fingers. Okay, so the webbing is what fish and ducks have, and we're related to them, but far, far away. So biogeography, I already told you, is the geographical distribution of species. And Darwin noted that, the Galapagos, okay, here's South America, here's the United States, here's North America, whatever. And the Galapagos are over here. So the species over here in South America were very closely related to the species on the Galapagos Island. So because that maybe the Galapagos Island was closer to South America at one point, and these birds, maybe in a storm, got blown over there, or they flew over there. But the geographical distance that exists now has made these birds different species than these, but closely related. So here we see different species of flightless birds, and they're colored on this map. And of course, this was stuck to that at one point. This fit in over here at one point. And this fit into here at one point. So it's no surprise that right here, we have all kinds of different species of flightless birds, but they're evolutionarily related. We can tell by their DNA and the proteins by comparing them. But it's interesting that it tells you how the continents were connected at one point, and the geographical distance leads to changes in the environment that cause different adaptations. So that's why different species. So let's do some review questions. Which of the following provides evidence that animals evolved from a common ancestor? All kinds of things. Molecular comparisons of DNA and protein, yes. Biogeography, yes. Comparative embryology, yes. All the above are correct. True. Even though this is the best, most precise way to do it. The best evidence that all cells have a common ancestor is this one. All cells share the same genetic code and use it in the same way. Okay, the chlorophyll molecule in plants, the hemoglobin molecule in mammals, has very similar structures. The fact that these molecules are so closely related is evidence that plants in us share a common ancestor. Okay, hemoglobin and chlorophyll evolve from the same molecule. Yes, molecules can evolve. Plants and animals all have a common ancestor, true. Most molecules that were made at the beginning of life on Earth are now extinct. That's not true. A lot of those molecules are still like DNA, RNA. They're still there. Proteins. So A and B are correct. So this is the right choice. Why is it difficult to distinguish between animal during early development? Because they share a common ancestor and they're related phylogenetically. They share the same development processes at early on, and then they specialize later on in development of the embryo. Animal embryos all begin to grow and develop under the control of the same set of genes. Well, I would say yeah on that. There's this one genetic plan that could encode, says what nature uses. There's all kinds of genes. Genes that can control, and they vary between the accords between the different species. Genes that control development or create independently for each species. No. They came from a common ancestor. So at least at the beginning, all embryos develop in with the same steps. And then differentiation occurs later on in the embryo development. Okay, back to Lamarck. His theory of evolution by acquired characteristics. Okay, so the harder the giraffe tries to reach the higher leaves to eat, the more information will be sent to his sperm or her egg that will give the baby giraffe that's formed from that sperm or egg the trait for a longer neck than the parent had. Okay, that is not what really happens, but which one of these describes that? Species evolve through development of characteristics that individuals use throughout their life. So the parent giraffe, by stretching his or her neck, causes the offspring to have a longer neck because of what the parent did all the time. Not true theory, but that was Lamarck, opposed to Darwin, who said no, long necks were an adaptation from some random event that occurred. We know today that's a mutation.